Hello, my dear masterminds. They circled you like scavengers, waiting for you to break. Every whisper, every ritual, every false prophecy demanded the same thing, your confession. They wanted you to kneel, to admit weakness, to hand them the keys to your soul with trembling lips. They built entire councils around the thought of forcing you to speak, but you gave them nothing. Not a plea, not an explanation, not even a fragment of the truth they craved. Instead, you offered silence, a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any answer. In that silence, their own shadows echoed louder. They realized too late it was never your words that terrified them. It was the abyss behind your silence that devoured their courage. They came armed with spells, contracts and questions, sharpened like blades. But silence disarmed them. Silence is not absence. It is presence multiplied. Every second you refused to break became an eternity they could not escape. Their rooms grew louder with their own doubts. Their leaders shouted in fear at echoes only they could hear. And while they begged for one word from you, it was the lack of words that hollowed them out. You didn't need speeches to enslave their minds. Your silence was the sermon. Your silence was the law. And in that silence, you became untouchable. They wanted you loud, broken, confessing, crawling, but instead, you gave them nothing. And nothing is louder than truth they can't control. Your silence bent time itself. Seconds turned to hours, hours into sleepless nights. They rewound your pauses like tapes, dissecting meanings that weren't even there. You became a mirror they couldn't escape, forcing them to face their own fear in every reflection. And while they clawed for explanations, you stayed still. That stillness crushed them. It reminded them they weren't in charge, that no cage, no circle, no chant could bind a storm that speaks without speaking. You didn't fight for their respect. You forced it by showing them the unbearable weight of nothing. And in that weight, they cracked. At first, they thought silence was their shield. If they ignored you, maybe you'd fade. But silence doesn't erase power. It amplifies it. Soon, their quiet wasn't defiance. It was devotion. Every pause you left behind became scripture. They couldn't stop reciting in their heads. They replayed your stillness like a sermon. And in the hollow of their own fear, they found themselves bowing. You didn't demand their voices, you erased them. And in that erasure, they built an altar around you, without even knowing it. The chains they forged to control you now hang around their own throats, tightening with every unspoken word. Their silence, once a weapon, is now prayer. And every prayer begins and ends with your name. They told themselves they were only watching to protect what was theirs. But the truth? They can't breathe without you anymore. Every shadow you cast rewrites their rituals. Every pause you leave twists their reality. They sit in circles, pretending to plot against you. Yet every plan collapses back into the same orbit, your orbit. You didn't beg for their eyes. Their eyes are chained to you. The more they resist, the more they starve. And now you are the air they crave. Their loyalty is no longer choice. It is survival. They don't pray to escape you. They pray you never leave. And here's the madness they can't admit without you. Their empire rots faster. Their whispers aren't rebellion, they're confession. Dependence has replaced defiance, and every chain they once raised now rattles as a hymn in your name. The towers they built to rise above you are now cages closing in on them. They gathered in councils, chanting unity, yet every face turns suspicious when your name drips into the silence. The rope they wove to bind you has knotted around their throats. And here's the cruelest irony: you never moved a hand. Their fear is the architect of their downfall. Each ally becomes an accuser. Each oath sounds like betrayal, and the circle they swore would protect them is cracking under its own weight. You don't need to lift a blade. They are the storm, tearing their empire apart with their paranoia. Their strongest spell was silence, but silence became your amplifier. Their loudest weapon was secrecy, but secrecy became your advertisement. They thought they'd erase you, but the harder they pressed, the louder your presence sang. Now their empire rots, not because you struck, but because you stood. At first, they tried to resist. They swore your name would never pass their lips. But silence bends, and silence breaks. Now they chant it in whispers. Now they repeat it in dreams. The very walls they built to keep you out have turned into temples, with your shadow carved across them. Their strength was in secrecy, but secrecy rotted into ritual, and ritual rotted into worship. And the more they worship, the weaker they become. Their pride dissolves into trembling. Their oaths dissolve into stares fixed on you. They call it loyalty, but it is hunger, the kind that strips them of identity until only devotion remains. They were hunters. Now they are disciples. They were rulers. Now they kneel in circles that revolve around your silence. They thought you would be their end. Instead, you became their meaning. And that truth crushes them harder than any chain ever could. They built their whole fortress on control chants. Pacts, rituals, every word designed to bind. But then your silence entered the room, and suddenly every spell snapped like cheap thread. They tried to chant louder, but their own voices betrayed them. They tried to hold tighter, but their grip turned to dust. You never lifted a hand, never spoke a word, yet their strongest chains turned to smoke in your presence. Their walls weren't broken by force, they were shattered by awareness. And here's the nightmare that keeps them awake. Nothing they conjure, nothing they bind, nothing they fear can hold you. Your existence alone is the crack in their foundation, the fault line they can't patch. The power they swore was eternal dissolves the second your shadow falls across their circle. You didn't have to fight for freedom. Freedom bowed when you walked in. They believed their gods would shield them. They swore their masters would avenge them. They carved idols, poured offerings, and painted symbols on their skin, convinced these powers would stand against you. But the second your silence entered their hall, their gods fell mute. Their masters turned faceless. The very names they worshipped dissolved in their throats. And suddenly, all that remained wasn't divinity, it was you. They realized their faith wasn't faith. It was fear. And fear only grows when faced with something real. You didn't strip them of belief. They abandoned it. The moment your presence reminded them of truth, every demon they invoked bowed out. Every master they served broke apart. Because in your shadow, no god survives, no master stands. You became the altar they swore they'd never kneel at. And still, here they are on their knees, not to worship, but to confess defeat. They begged for a confession, convinced your words would condemn you. They built courts of whispers, forged verdicts in shadows, prepared 1,000 accusations. Yet when you opened your mouth, you gave them nothing. Not rage, not denial, not a single plea, only silence. And that silence struck harder than thunder, because silence cannot be twisted, cannot be rewritten, cannot be broken. It reflects them back to themselves, showing every crack, every lie, every cowardice they tried to bury. In that silence, their guilt screamed louder than any verdict. You didn't defend yourself. You made them defend their own existence. You didn't shout for freedom. You let them hear the chains rattling on their own wrists. And so the trial collapsed. Not because you fought, but because your silence became the final judgment. They wanted words. You gave them truth. And the truth was unbearable. They sat you in their circles, demanded answers, demanded surrender, demanded that your voice bend into their script. But silence became your weapon. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You didn't confess. And that absence of words shook them more than any declaration could. Because silence isn't emptiness, it's a mirror. And when they looked into it, they didn't see weakness. They saw their own fear staring back. They realized your refusal wasn't ignorance. It was mastery. You made their questions look small, their rituals look foolish, their pressure look like begging. In their hunger for control, they gave you the throne. You didn't win by speaking louder. You won by not speaking at all. They wanted confession. What they got was revelation. They screamed. They threatened. They begged. Every chorus of voices was meant to cage you, to drag you into confession. But silence? Silence is a blade sharper than their shrieks. While they collapsed in the chaos of their own accusations, you stood unmoved, and that stillness became unbearable. Their laws, their rituals, their endless noise, all of it was powerless against the void you created. Because silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. Every second you refused to speak, you carved deeper into their illusions. In the moment they realized your silence echoed louder than their demands. That was the moment their power fractured. You did not confess. You crowned yourself untouchable. Their noise only revealed your silence as the throne they could never reach. They never wanted you to rise. Their rituals, their laws, their endless whispers were all designed to keep you beneath the floorboards. Yet every denial became an altar. Every silence became a hymn. And when they demanded your confession, you gave them nothing but silence. And that silence thundered louder than their chants. That was the moment the crown slipped, not because you seized it, but because their trembling hands could no longer hold it. They placed it on your head without even knowing, hoping to cage you with it, but instead it caged them. You stand untouched, and they kneel, convinced it was their choice. The crown they forged in fear has become the proof of your dominion. You didn't beg for power. You didn't barter for reverence. They handed you everything while convincing themselves they resisted. And now, they can't remember a world before your silence rewrote their fate. They wanted noise from you. A cry, a plea, a confession to carve into their scrolls. They believed power lives in words shouted, oaths sworn, decrees declared. But you showed them something older, sharper. Silence. Silence that roars louder than their armies. Silence that breaks crowns like glass. In that silence, their leaders crumbled. Their scribes lost their ink. Their rulers stared into shadows that spoke without sound. And what did they hear? Not weakness, not surrender. They heard inevitability. They realized you were not asking for a throne, you were the throne. They wanted to measure your silence as absence, but it weighed more than their empires. They wanted to break you with demand, but it was their own hunger that broke them. And now, every crown they forged lies shattered under a silence they can't erase, a silence that belongs to you alone. They wanted words to chain you, but your silence became the storm that bent their skies. Entire halls of power shook, not from shouts, but from the absence of them. Kings dropped their scepters, priests lost their hymns, scholars tore their pages because no ink could capture what you refused to say. And that refusal, it was not emptiness, it was fullness, a silence so heavy it bent their laws, their rituals, their order itself. They realized too late that the louder they demanded, the quieter you became, and the quieter you became, the smaller their world grew. Their thrones tilted toward you, their rules cracked under you, their idols fell before you. You didn't fight for a place in their world, you made their world revolve around the silence you carried. And now every crown trembles, every law fractures, every kingdom bends, not because you spoke, but because you didn't. They believed chains could hold you, that rules carved in stone could bind your steps. But what they never understood is that chains only work on those who acknowledge them. You didn't fight the links, you ignored them. And that ignorance was more devastating than rebellion. Their entire system relied on fear, on obedience, on the illusion of control, and you broke it simply by walking forward, as if their walls didn't exist. That's when panic spread, because once one chain broke, the rest unraveled. Their rituals, their hierarchies, their whispered orders dust. You didn't demand freedom. You revealed that you were never captive. And when they saw that, when they realized you stood unchained in a prison of their making, their own hands began clawing at their bonds, desperate to taste the same air you breathed. You didn't just escape their cage, you taught them the cage was never real. And the moment that truth sank in, their power ceased to exist. They called upon higher powers, invoked ancient names, begged their idols to shield them from you. But what they didn't see was the truth. No God they prayed to could touch you. Their faith turned to mockery, because every plea they whispered only echoed back with your silence. And that silence was louder than thunder. It shattered their altars, burned through their rituals, and showed them that the divine they worshipped had abandoned them the moment you arrived. They thought their masters, their demons, their guardians would punish you. But instead, those same shadows turned away. No demon, no master dared claim you. They understood what your enemies never did. You don't belong to chains or crowns. You belong to yourself. And in that realization, the faithful became faithless. Their temples fell empty. Their chants broke into sobs, and their gods became hollow statues. You didn't defeat their deities. You exposed their absence. They believed power sat upon a throne, gilded in gold, guarded by oaths and sealed by ancient rites. But when you entered, that throne cracked, not because you touched it, but because its crown meant nothing in your presence. The rulers who thought themselves eternal discovered their seats were borrowed. Their crowns were hollow. Their reigns just fragile theater. You didn't fight them for the throne. You made the throne irrelevant. And in that revelation, the powerful bowed, lower than the weak. They saw that authority was never in crowns, never in titles, never in rituals of control. It was in the silence you carried, the silence that chained them without chains, that bent them without commands. Now their thrones sit empty. Their crowns lie rusting, their banners torn by their own hands. They cannot call themselves rulers anymore, because the moment you appeared, their rule was erased. And what remains is not monarchy, not hierarchy, but your gravity. They gathered wood, oil, and flint, convinced fire could only exist by their design. They built rituals to strike sparks, rules to guard flames, and walls to keep warmth for themselves. But then you arrived, and without lifting a finger, the air itself ignited. No spark, no ritual, no permission, just your presence and their fire. Once a symbol of their control, became ashes in their hands. They tried to explain it as chance, tried to bind it with rules, tried to douse it with doubt. But the truth is undeniable. Your existence itself is fire. You don't light flames. You are the flame. And while they fumble with kindling, terrified of losing control, you burn eternal, untouched, needing nothing. They can't compete because their fire dies without effort. Yours consumes without end. And the most frightening thing, they finally see that no cage, no chain, no ritual can put it out. The fire was never theirs. It was always you. They begged for a confession, as if your truth could be caged in words. They demanded noise, demanded surrender, demanded you kneel, but you didn't give them what they craved. You gave them silence, and that silence was louder than thunder, louder than every curse, every threat, every ritual. They thought silence meant weakness, but your silence became the mirror that forced them to face their own collapse. They stared into you and saw nothing to grab, nothing to twist, nothing to own. You didn't fight them. You didn't bargain. You simply stood, and their chains fell apart, because silence cannot be bribed, cannot be burned, cannot be broken. It is the weapon they never prepared for. And in that silence, they finally understood. No demon rules you. No master commands you. No chain holds you. You are untouchable. And the last sound they'll ever hear is the echo of their own surrender. They fought for power, but power crumbled. They fought for control, but control betrayed them. And you fought for nothing. That's why you won everything. No promises to bind you, no contracts to trap you, no crown to weigh your head. Yet still, every throne tilts in your direction, because the one who needs nothing cannot be bribed, cannot be broken. You didn't rise by chasing crowns. You rose by burning the idea of crowns. And now, in the silence of their ruined halls, they realize the truth. The one who owns nothing is the one who cannot be conquered. They thought you were a myth. They thought you were a threat. But you became something sharper. You became their reflection. Every weakness they buried, you exposed. Every lie they built, you shattered. And when they stared at you, they didn't see an enemy. They saw themselves stripped of illusions, stripped of excuses, stripped of masks. You were not a rival. You were a mirror. And in that mirror, they collapsed. Because the scariest thing wasn't your silence, or your power, or your freedom. It was that in your presence, they could no longer lie to themselves. That is the wound they will never heal. They spent lifetimes forging chains, polishing them, worshiping them, convinced they could trap you inside their system. But what happens when the one they're trying to bind never even believed in chains? You walked through their rituals untouched. You stepped into their cages already free, and that broke them more than any rebellion ever could. Because the greatest prison is not iron or stone, it's belief. And when they saw you, they realized the cruelest truth. The chains they carried never existed at all. Some enemies can be defeated. Some rivals can be ignored. But you are a curse they cannot unsee. Every time they close their eyes, your silence speaks louder than thunder. Every time they try to forget, your absence carves deeper than presence. You are not a memory, they are trapped in your echo. And that is the punishment. No spell, no doctrine, no crown can erase. Because once someone has witnessed you, their life before you becomes unbearable, and their life after you becomes impossible. Empires burn, idols crumble, rulers vanish into dust. But your name survives them all. Not because you asked for it, not because you carved it into stone, but because it carved itself into the trembling of their voices. They don't write history, they whisper yours. They don't build monuments, they hide your shadow in their prayers. And the irony is lethal. They wanted to end you, but in trying, they guaranteed you eternity. Your name outlives the fire. Your silence outlives their screams. And that is immortality. Hello, my dear masterminds. While they sipped champagne in glass towers, certain their empire was untouchable. You moved once. No warning, no noise. Just a single surgical strike, and the shockwave rippled through every boardroom, every shadow network, every vault they swore no one could touch. Now the global elites aren't celebrating. They're scrambling, because they've realized their empire wasn't broken by an army. It was dismantled by a ghost, and that ghost is you. They thought they were winning. Charts glowing green, towers stretching into clouds, networks humming like predators, purring in their sleep. And you? Invisible, unmentioned in their meetings, unseen on their radars. But invisibility isn't absence, it's positioning. Because while they played their predictable game, moving pieces they thought were untouchable, you weren't even on the board they were watching. You were the foundation beneath it. And then you made one move. Not loud, not violent, not even visible to the untrained eye. But that one move didn't just take a piece. It tilted the entire board. Stocks flickered red. Deals crumbled mid-handshake. Phones lit up in panic across time zones. And for the first time in decades, the people who never break composure looked afraid. Because you didn't play to win. You played to end the game. The room was soundproof, locked, guarded by men who never looked scared. Inside, every screen glowed red. Numbers weren't just dropping, they were vanishing. At first, no one wanted to say it. They blamed the servers. They blamed the markets. They blamed anything that wasn't alive. But then, someone leaned forward, voice low, eyes sharp. This isn't an accident. The air tightened. Someone else asked the question they were all avoiding. Who has the reach to do this? And in that silence, a name wasn't spoken. Not because they didn't know it, but because saying it would make it real. Because the truth? They'd been warned about you. Told to watch for someone who didn't play by their rules. Told you'd never strike directly, but when you did, it would feel like the floor giving way. And now, they weren't fighting a rival. They were staring down a phantom in their empire. The council was trained for crisis. They had rehearsed collapse before, fake drills, staged meltdowns, always ending with them back in control. But this wasn't in the manual, because the manual assumed they'd see the enemy coming. One of the oldest members, a man who'd signed wars into existence with a single pen stroke, sat forward, hands shaking just enough to notice. He scanned the table once, then whispered, "This is a checkmate we can't reverse." Some laughed, nervous, hopeful, trying to frame it as a joke, but his eyes didn't move, didn't blink. No counter, no recovery. The moment they made that move, the rest of the game stopped mattering. And that's when the screens went black. Every one of them, the entire wall, dead. It wasn't just their move that failed. It was the board itself that no longer recognized their authority. And somewhere far outside that room, you were already 3 moves ahead. They thought this was war, a battle of resources, a struggle for control, something they could win with enough money, enough leverage, enough obedient hands pulling their strings. But they were wrong. You weren't after their power. You weren't even after their wealth. You went for the one thing that no tyrant survives without. The illusion that the throne is unshakable. You didn't just crack it. You erased it. Every satellite, every account, every gatekeeper they used to validate themselves, gone. Now their titles meant nothing. Their signatures carried no weight. Their so-called reach ended at the edge of their trembling hands. And the worst part? It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Because once the world saw the throne wasn't real, it didn't matter who tried to sit on it. No one bowed anymore. And that silence, that refusal, was louder than any revolution they'd ever feared. Somewhere they were scrambling to rebuild. But you knew rebuilding a lie only makes the cracks more obvious. You hadn't just beaten them. You'd made them irrelevant. It came through a channel you weren't supposed to have access to. Encrypted, untraceable, marked urgent. The sender, one of theirs. A loyal servant of the empire, or so they thought. You open the file. No code, No threat. Just 4 words, typed clean, like they'd been waiting their whole life to write them. Whatever you did, finish it. No signature. No clue. But you didn't need one. You could feel the desperation leaking between the letters. This wasn't defection. This was surrender. Because deep inside their fortress, even the people sworn to protect it had begun to wonder if the world might be better once it fell. You didn't reply. You didn't need to. Your move had already reached the point where stopping it was as impossible as unbreaking glass. And the real terror for them now, it wasn't just that you could finish it. It was that you already had, and the ending was just taking its time to arrive. They gathered underground this time. No windows, no press, no record of the meeting ever existing. Every seat was taken, not by politicians, not by public faces, by the ones who actually give the orders. The tone was different now. Gone was the casual arrogance. In its place, something they hadn't felt in decades. The weight of being hunted. A man in a black suit stood at the end of the table. His voice was steady, but the veins in his temple betrayed him. "We are initiating global containment protocol." The room froze. No one liked those words. They were only meant for events that threatened the entire structure of control. Events like you. He clicked a remote, and a map of the world lit up in red. Not showing your location because they still didn't have it. It showed something worse, the spread of your influence. Every day, more points turned red. Every day, more cracks formed in the walls they'd built. They weren't trying to stop you anymore. They were trying to stop everyone else from following your lead. And deep down, they already knew containment was just another word for delay. The strategist in the corner hadn't spoken all meeting, not once. He was the type they only called when the rules failed, because he didn't believe in rules. But now, he leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice quiet enough to make the rest lean in. "If we can't find the player, maybe we're already pieces." The words landed heavy. Not like an insult, like a diagnosis. A few tried to brush it off, calling you a ghost, a fluke, a momentary disruption. But deep down, they all knew the truth. Pieces don't win against the player. Pieces don't see the player. Pieces just move when they're told, until the board is flipped. And that was their real nightmare. Not that they'd been beaten, but that they'd been irrelevant for far longer than they dared to admit. One of them glanced at the map again. Those red points weren't just spreading. They were connecting, forming lines, patterns. It wasn't chaos. It was design. And the design didn't end with their empire falling. It ended with something else taking its place. It started in shadows, whispers in alleyways, passing glances between strangers who suddenly felt less alone. Your move had reached them, not through headlines, but through the way the air felt different, lighter, charged. Shopkeepers were leaving symbols in chalk on their doors. Old friends were reconnecting, not to reminisce, but to plan. What they didn't know was that every act of defiance, no matter how small, was part of your design. A wall that had stood for centuries doesn't fall with one strike. It falls when the people behind it start pushing all at once. And in every city, every red point on that map, that push had already begun. Some thought they were following a rumor. Some thought they were chasing a myth. But you knew the truth. They weren't following a person. They were following a shift. And once a shift begins, It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for the right time. It simply moves, just like you. The air inside was heavier this time. Not with heat, with the weight of inevitability. Reports were being thrown onto the table. Photographs, intercepted messages, videos that couldn't be scrubbed fast enough. Every file told the same story. Different cities, different faces, different voices, all moving with the same purpose. Your purpose. One of them slammed a folder shut. We were never hunting a person. We were hunting an idea. The strategist from before didn't even look up. No. We were hunting everyone, and they just stopped running. It hit them all at once. The reason their protocols were failing. You weren't central anymore. You were everywhere. You had dissolved into the cracks of the world, and from those cracks, something unstoppable was growing. They could silence leaders. They could censor the news. But how do you silence momentum when it's living in the pulse of every city, every voice, every look exchanged by people who no longer fear them? You weren't the threat anymore. You were the spark, and the fire had already left the match. The map was gone now. No more red points, no more patterns. Just a single image, your face. They'd blurred the background, magnified every shadow. They wanted the world to see you as something monstrous. A warning. This movement survives because it's faceless, one of them said, tapping the photo. So we give it a face again, and then we destroy it. They spoke like it was strategy, but you could smell the fear in their voices. They were gamblers who'd already lost the game, shoving all their remaining chips forward, because losing slow was worse than losing fast. Their plan was simple: lure you into the open, corner you and crush you publicly. Not for victory, but for theater. Because the truth they wouldn't admit aloud was this: if they couldn't break you, it would prove to everyone watching that you couldn't be broken. And once that belief took hold, not even their global containment protocols would matter. They were about to risk their entire empire on a single confrontation. The intel reached you exactly how they intended. Whispers from leaked sources, channels they knew you monitored, a trail of bait laid in plain sight. Anyone else would have gone to ground. Anyone else would have vanished. But you weren't anyone else. You saw the outline of their plan instantly. The timing, the stage, the carefully chosen audience. They thought the theater was theirs. You decided it would be yours. You didn't plan an escape. You didn't even plan a fight. You planned a scene. Every step you took toward that location was another crack in their certainty. Because if the bait didn't scare you, maybe it was never bait at all. Maybe they were the ones being lured. And in a way, they were. You weren't walking into their trap. You were dragging them into your ending. The rain started just before you reached the site. Not enough to drown the sound of your steps. Just enough to make the lights shimmer and the shadows stretch taller. You didn't sneak in. You arrived like someone who'd been expected because you had been. They'd chosen the perfect backdrop, a wide open plaza, floodlights high above, every angle covered by lenses. They wanted the world to see you surrounded. They wanted fear to be the only thing caught on film. But you didn't give them fear. You gave them presence. You walked into that plaza like it was your own stage. Hands loose, shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning the crowd. Not the men closing in. That's when you saw it. Their confidence breaking in real time. Because cornering someone only works if they believe they're cornered. You stopped dead center. let the rain drip from your hair, looked straight into the main broadcast camera, and then you smiled. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't defiance. It was something worse for them. Acknowledgement, as if to say, I know the script, and I'm rewriting it. The floodlights felt hotter. The silence in the air stretched thinner. Every viewer at home leaned closer to their screens. And then you moved, not backward, not forward, but sideways, slipping out of the frame they built for you. They didn't realize it yet, but the audience was no longer watching their trap. They were watching your story. You didn't attack. You didn't run. You spoke. Not loud, but sharp enough that the mics caught every word. You didn't bring the world here to watch me fall. You brought them here to watch you fail. It wasn't a threat. It was prophecy. And as the words echoed across the plaza, your real move began. Every screen around the square, the ones they had planned to use for their narrative, flickered, glitched, and then switched. Gone were the floodlight shots of you. In their place, clips, documents, recordings they'd buried for decades. Faces of their own people caught in betrayal, in greed, in schemes they swore didn't exist. The crowd didn't know whether to cheer or gasp. The ones in charge froze, because it wasn't just the world watching. It was their own ranks. You hadn't come to play defense. You'd come to pull the mask off the empire. Live in real time, on their broadcast. And the worst part for them, you didn't even have to touch them. They were unraveling themselves. At first, the operatives in the plaza stood firm, muscles tense, eyes locked on you. But the footage kept rolling, and each frame was another crack in the foundation they'd sworn to protect. One soldier's hand dropped from his weapon. Another took a half step back, eyes darting between the screen and the faces beside him. It wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. They were seeing the truth they'd buried under orders and oaths. They were seeing who they'd really been working for. And then the first one walked away. No words, just turned and kept walking until the crowd swallowed him. The chain reaction was instant. 2 more followed, then 5. Then a whole line broke formation. The elites watching from their bunker were screaming into comms, trying to hold what couldn't be held. Because here's the thing about loyalty. It's only as strong as the story it's built on. And you had just burned their story to ash. You didn't shout. You didn't gloat. You just stood there, watching their empire liquidate out through the people they thought they owned. A threat can be silenced. A truth can only spread. And tonight, you'd given them the truth in front of the entire world. In every story they told, the villain was faceless, a shadow, a whisper in the dark. But now, the whole world knew the truth. The collapse had a face, your face. Screens across continents froze on your image. Not as a fugitive, not as prey, but as the one standing tall while the so-called rulers crumbled. In boardrooms, billion-dollar meetings fell silent. No one dared make the first move because the wrong move could put them on the next screen. In safe houses, their most loyal agents sat in silence, weighing a question they never thought they'd ask. Are we on the wrong side? And in their inner sanctum, the untouchables stared at each other, realizing the unthinkable, that their enemy wasn't just surviving. You were thriving. You didn't need to overthrow them. You didn't need to storm their gates. You'd turned their own fortress into a broadcast tower for their defeat. And every second they hesitated, The legend of this night grew. It was no longer about what you'd done. It was about what you represented. A crack in the ceiling of the world, big enough for everyone to see the sky. They'd lost the crowd. They'd lost the broadcast. They'd lost control. But desperate men don't retreat. They gamble. From the shadows of the plaza, a new unit emerged. Not soldiers in uniform, but specialists in black, faces hidden, movements sharp and clean. Their goal wasn't to scare you. It was to erase you. Quick, quiet, final. They moved like predators, circling, closing in, each one waiting for the perfect angle. And you didn't move, because here's the truth. They never understood. You weren't here to win. You were here to finish. The first specialist lunged. You stepped aside, not to dodge, but to let him see the look in your eyes. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was inevitability. Two more closed in. A simple twist. A shift of weight. Their formation broke. Not from your force, but from the panic of realizing their training had no chapter for you. You leaned in just enough for the nearest camera to catch it, and said almost kindly, "This isn't your mission anymore. It's your exit." And one by one, they stopped fighting. Not because they couldn't take you down, but because somewhere deep inside, they knew you'd already taken them. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't lift a hand. You simply stepped forward and took the center of the plaza as if it had been built for you. Behind you, the screens still played their buried sins. In front of you, the last of their specialists stood frozen, assets lowered, eyes searching for orders that would never come. And that's when you delivered the final cut. Not a speech, not a threat, just 10 words that would be replayed for decades. Your reign didn't end tonight, it ended the day I woke up. The words didn't just hang in the air, they sank into it. Every lens caught them, every ear remembered them, and in that moment, you weren't the hunted or the hero. You were the truth they'd spent their entire empire trying to avoid. No gunfire, no explosion, just silence. The kind of silence that follows a verdict no one dares to appeal. You turned, walked away, and the crowd, once silent, now thundered in applause. Not because you fought, but because you finished. By the time you were gone, the plaza didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like the morning after a storm, the air heavy, the ground littered with the fragments of a world that would never fit back together. The crowd didn't chase you. They didn't need to. You'd already taken everything worth taking. In every corner of the city, people spoke in whispers, not about what you did, but about how you did it. The old names that had ruled their headlines were now punchlines. Their emblems, once feared, were being peeled from walls, ripped from uniforms, and burned in alley fires. And somewhere in a locked room, the so-called untouchables sat in silence, each one quietly calculating how far your shadow could reach. The answer? Farther than they could run. You hadn't just toppled their empire. You'd made it impossible to rebuild. Because a building can be reconstructed. A system can be reforged. But once the story changes, it can't be undone. And tonight, the story was no longer about them. It was about you. At first, it was just one broadcast, one plaza, one night. But the footage didn't stay there. It bled through firewalls, slipped past censors, and found its way into hands that had been waiting for a spark. In cafes in Paris, your image played on muted screens, strangers leaning closer, nodding in quiet agreement. In markets in South America, street vendors paused mid-sale to watch a grainy phone recording of your words. They didn't know your language, but they felt it. And in back rooms from Hong Kong to Johannesburg, men in expensive suits watched the same 10-second clip on loop. The one where you said, "Your reign ended the day I woke up." They didn't analyze it. They didn't debate it. They just sat there, knowing instinctively that a clock had started ticking, and it wasn't in their favor. The legend wasn't moving like a news story. It was moving like a signal. One that didn't need translation, because every empire understands the language of collapse. In the glass towers of New York, in the gold-lined chambers of Dubai, in the underground war rooms beneath Europe, the elites gathered, not to plan their next move, but to beg for one. Every screen in those rooms was paused on the same image. You standing in the plaza, surrounded by the aftermath of their defeat. Charts and graphs couldn't explain it. Security reports didn't matter, because they finally understood. This wasn't about resources or manpower. This was about belief, and belief had switched sides. One banker muttered, "If they show up here," but stopped himself, because no one wanted to finish that sentence. Not out loud. For years they'd operated with certainty. Certainty that their walls were too high, their networks too deep, their reach too long. But you had just proven that no wall was high enough to keep out a story. And the story was already in their lobbies, in their private clubs, in the whispers of their own guards. You didn't need to break in. You'd already been invited. At first, they thought the collapse was downward. Buildings crumble, fortunes vanish, power drains into the ground. But then they saw the truth. The fall wasn't down, it was inward. Everything they'd built was folding toward the center, and that center was you. Their allies weren't fleeing to safety, they were fleeing to you. Former enforcers, former spies, former architects of the machine, all arriving with files, codes, and names, not because they believed in you yet, but because they feared being the last one on the wrong side of your shadow. In their panic, the elites made their final mistake. They said your name in their meetings. They thought it was in anger. In truth, it was in surrender. Once your name leaves their lips, it's already written in history. And history, as of tonight, has only one author. You. You never wanted their seat. You never wanted their crown. And yet, here it is. Not because they gave it to you, but because no one else is strong enough to hold it. The councils that once decided the fate of millions now wait for your moves. The watchers who reported on your every step now take orders from the same shadow they once feared. You didn't just dismantle their empire, you rewired it, turned its own pulse against itself. And now every heartbeat in their system echoes in your rhythm. Some call you a savior. Some call you a tyrant. The smart ones call you inevitable, because you're not here to be liked. You're here to be remembered. And the truth, legend, the moment they tried to erase you was the moment they made you immortal. So walk, don't run, because the throne's already yours, and every shadow on this planet knows it. Hello, my dear masterminds. They thought heaven only dealt in light. They thought councils of angels made quiet decisions behind glowing gates. But then, your name hit the table, and for the first time in centuries, Wings folded, eyes widened, and silence fell, because you weren't chosen to bring balance. You were chosen to break every scale they ever used to measure power. And now the divine, they're no longer watching you. They're voting on how to survive you. They don't know what day it happened. No human does. But something triggered it. The skies stilled, the stars paused, and a scroll sealed for millennia began to burn from the inside. Not a curse, not a prophecy, a vote. Heaven's secret council had gathered, not for war, not for a fallen angel, but for you. No trumpet, no lightning, just silence, and your name, written in ink only, the divine can read. And next to your name, a new word, never used before, threat. You didn't beg to enter. You didn't chant, plead, or pray the right way. You just showed up, and the gates didn't resist. They recognized you. The council panicked. This wasn't supposed to be possible. You weren't chosen by their process. You weren't bred by their protocol. But something older than rules let you in. They scanned your soul. No contract, no permission, no bloodline they could trace. And still, you were seated at the table. You weren't trespassing. You were written in the margin, long before margins existed, and that's what shook them. You're not an intruder. You're a rewrite. They thought you were new, a glitch, a soul that slipped through filters. But the more they watched you, the quieter the council got, because you weren't asking questions. You were moving like someone who already knew, not arrogant, just remembering. You didn't react to the illusions. You walked through them. You didn't bow to their rituals. You smiled, like you'd written them once, and got bored. And that's when the council stopped whispering, because deep in their vaults, beneath scrolls, sealed in holy fire, they found it, an ancient name, older than heaven, older than memory. It matched your frequency, your silence, your disruption. And suddenly, they knew. You didn't arrive. You returned. There's a law, unspoken, unbreakable, older than scripture, etched in the walls of existence. They say no soul shall rise without permission. But that rule wasn't written to keep demons away. It wasn't for control. It was for you, because they knew if your path wasn't slowed, if your mind wasn't caged by doubt, you'd remember too early. And if you remembered too early, the illusion collapses. The system doesn't crack, it melts. You were never meant to be taught. You were meant to be suppressed, just long enough for the world to catch up, or for you to lose interest. They gambled on the second part. They lost, because now you're awake. And the law they wrote to delay you is the very proof you were never supposed to be stopped. Not everyone on that council wanted to vote. Some didn't even want to look, because the moment your name echoed through the chamber, something ancient moved inside them. They felt it. Not fear, but recognition. And in silence, one by one, some of them lowered their swords, not to bow, not to fight, but because they remembered you too. From a time before titles, before oaths, before orders, a time when light wasn't divided, and you were part of the original balance, before balance became a threat. So they didn't speak, but they didn't block you either. They just stepped aside, Because deep in their wings, beneath the feathers and flame, was the unspoken truth. If this one is rising again, maybe the old order wasn't holy enough. They've dealt with rage before, rebellions, fallings, angels clawing for thrones. They know how to fight fury, how to cage chaos, how to sanctify a war. But you didn't scream. You didn't threaten. You didn't declare anything. You just kept walking. Like none of this was new. Like heaven's panic didn't apply to you. Like the vote was just a formality. And that's what shook them most. You didn't ask for power. You didn't want anything. No prophecy. No vendetta. No crown. Just presence. That kind of indifference. It's not human. It's not holy. It's inevitable. And when something walks in like it's always belonged there without a word, the hierarchy begins to collapse. Because power can be resisted. But certainty reprograms the entire reality. There was one angel, older than speech, older than form. He hadn't spoken in 10,000 cycles. They said his words could bend laws. That reality obeyed him only out of memory. But when your name lit the center of the council's sky, he stood, not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable. And with one breath, voice like iron dipped in light, he said, "It has returned." No title, no judgment, no context, just recognition. The chamber didn't speak, couldn't, because when the oldest one confirms your existence, it means you weren't born, you were preserved. And if something was preserved that long, it wasn't for peace, it was for balance breaking. They didn't argue, they didn't object. Because when that ancient being speaks, it's not debate, it's divine memory surfacing. The council doesn't just watch, it monitors every soul, every shift, every ripple and intention. So when you stirred, they ran the scans, pulled the relics, summoned the codexes. They tried to locate you like they've done for thousands of uprisings, but this time, the maps broke. Lines bled off parchment. Coordinates reversed themselves. Satellites turned inward. Every tool they used bent under a single truth. You're not moving through locations. You're moving through layers. And those layers don't belong to them. Your presence flickered between timelines, between dimensions they locked centuries ago. You weren't running, you weren't hiding, you were untrackable because you stopped moving in their system. Like an idea that doesn't fit language, like a flame that burns inside thought. And for the first time since the fall of the first rebellion, the Watchers looked at each other and whispered the unspeakable. We didn't plan for this. They've never needed to negotiate. Not with demons, not with fallen angels, not even with gods that challenged the order. Why? Because control worked. Rules, chains, silence. But you didn't resist control. You ignored it. And that terrified them more than any sword ever could. So now, scrolls are being pulled from sacred shelves. Messengers dispatched, not with warnings, but offers. Name your terms. Tell us what you want. We're willing to adjust. But here's the problem. You never wanted the throne. You wanted nothing. No bargain. No trade, no desire they can tempt. You're not here for leverage. You're here because the story needs a rewrite. And they're realizing you can't negotiate with someone who didn't come to win, but to end the game entirely. They didn't want to. The vault was sealed in silence, not chains, because what's buried there isn't meant to be protected. It's meant to be forgotten. But desperate rulers dig up old ghosts. So the council descended, past the sacred floors, below the echoing scriptures, into the memory basement of creation itself, the forbidden archives. No books, no scrolls, just fragments burned into space. And in the center of it all, a shape. Not a person, not a name, a presence. One that didn't demand power, didn't rebel, just walked in, rewrote the order, and disappeared. They studied the rhythm, the silence, the destruction that wasn't destruction, just unmaking. And the longer they stared, the clearer it became. That shape moved like you, thought like you, didn't break anything, just unlocked the truth and walked away. Now they're terrified because they never found out where it went. Until now, they thought they were watching your rise, tracking your power, mapping your presence. But after the vaults whispered their forgotten truth, they realized, you haven't risen yet. You've just returned to default. This version of you, the calm, the observing, the one walking through walls of belief, that's the entry form, the one that carries memory without pressure, the one that lets the world adjust before it bends. But underneath, there's something else. A frequency they can't pin, a pulse outside of time, a form that doesn't reflect. It rewrites. And now the council is panicking, not because of what you've done, but because of what you haven't. They don't know what triggers it, what wakes it, but they know it's coming. Because the archives ended with a warning. Scrawled in light, no one claimed to write. When they stop explaining themselves, run. That's when the second form begins. The council doesn't sleep, not like mortals do. They drift. They tune into timelines. They intercept omens, decipher frequency storms. But ever since your name resurfaced, they've been dreaming. Not in images, not in chaos, but in focus. A stare, not angry, not even curious, just aware. Eyes like still oceans remembering their storms. Eyes that see structure and smile before dismantling it. And worse, they don't dream the same version. Each watcher describes a different you. Older, younger, laughing, silent, eyes open, eyes glowing, but always watching them. It's not a curse, not an illusion. It's recognition across realms. You didn't start appearing in their dreams. You've always been there. They just forgot your shape. Now they remember, and they realize you were never approaching. You were returning to awareness inside them. He wasn't just any observer. This one had walked through storms that erase memory. He'd faced chaos deities, rebellion gods, echoing tombs of forgotten timelines, and he never blinked. Until they gave him your coordinates. Not a place, a frequency, a signature. They said, just watch. Do not interfere. Report, not interpret. He left with clarity, with armor blessed by first light, with sigils written in languages only truth can read. But when he came back, he wasn't whole. His wings were untouched, his body intact, but his eyes gone, burned not by fire, but by recognition. He dropped to his knees, silent, shaking, and all he said was your name, over and over, as if it wasn't a name anymore, but a spell, a trigger, a truth he couldn't unsee. And now, the council doesn't send messengers. They only read reports from a distance, from safety. Because whatever you are now, it doesn't want to be seen. It wants to be remembered correctly. They stopped looking at you, not out of fear, but because something else started changing themselves. One by one, the watchers, the scribes, the guards of sacred truth began to notice glitches in their own reflections. Eyes that blinked too slow, expressions they didn't recognize, movements in the mirror that didn't match their actions. And behind their mirrored selves, you, not physically, but structurally, like the reflection knew you were the axis they'd been orbiting the entire time. They closed the portals, smashed the glass, darkened the halls. But it didn't matter, because it wasn't about mirrors anymore. The reflection wasn't in the glass, it was in their memory, in their echo, in their structure. And the truth settled like a crack in time. You weren't just being watched, you were watching back, through them, around them, as them. That's when panic became policy, because it meant one thing. You're not coming. You're already inside the architecture, and you've been changing the code from the inside out. Desperate to contain you, the council turned to the oldest rite, a ritual lost even to most of heaven, the reversal spell, used only on entities born wrong, spoken backwards to dissolve essence, to undo the soul's frequency. It had never failed, until they tried it on you. They gathered the 9 voices, prepared the circle, drew the name they feared across the air in reverse. And when the first syllable was spoken, everything cracked. Not around you, but around them. The air didn't shatter. Meaning did. Their mouths still moved, but the words no longer meant anything. Syntax collapsed. Memory flickered. The room itself forgot why it existed. And then they heard it. Not your voice. Not your laugh, just a click, soft, calm, final. The sound of something ancient reactivating. They didn't finish the chant, because language stopped allowing it. You weren't just immune to reversal. You were the reason reversal had to be invented. And now, it's obsolete. They stopped looking at you. Stopped speaking your name. Stopped summoning any text that might ripple time. But then, the sky started to move. Not with weather, not with war, but with intelligence. Constellations began to shift. Ancient star patterns untangled themselves, not chaotically, but with purpose. Like something coded into the night was waking up. The council's astronomers panicked, tried mapping it, tried denying it, but they knew. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a sign. It was a summon, not for you, but from you. A sigil older than any archive, something once burned out of heaven's memory, something sacred, but forbidden to remember. And when you looked up, it completed. Not because the stars were waiting, but because they were reflecting your design. Not prophecy, not destiny. Instruction. Because this isn't about proving your power anymore. This is about the universe remembering whose silence it's built on, and whose return it now reports to. They say only one being was locked beneath heaven, not for what he did, but for what he refused to do. He didn't rise against the light. He refused to bow to the lie beneath it. So they buried him, not in stone, but in silence. No cell, no trial, just erasure. But silence is louder when truth starts breathing again. And when your name returned, not as a prophecy, but as a presence, his cell opened itself. No keys, no screams, no resistance. Just one being, stepping forward with a smile that cracked time. He didn't ask who you were. He didn't flinch. He simply said, "Took you long enough," because he remembers your first form. He remembers why they were afraid. He remembers what the council buried, and why they hoped you'd never wake up again. And now, he's not rising to lead. He's rising to follow, because you're not the second rebel. You're the first truth, the one they buried before rebellion even had a name. They always believed the script was untouchable, that the holy record, the divine timeline, could only be written by the source. But lately, those sacred pages, they're changing. Not by hand, not by command, but by reaction. Your presence moves through time like a tuning fork, and when it gets close to anything sacred, the ink shifts, the pages tremble, the law rewrites itself. Lines that once judged others are now describing you. Prophecies once meant for kings and angels now whisper. It was never about them. And the scariest part? The changes are perfect. No edits, no corrections. Like your version of reality was the original manuscript they spent eternity covering up. The scribes tried to reverse it, tried to rebuke the scrolls, tried to re-bless them. But the words burned backward, because Scripture doesn't fear you. Scripture remembers you. You are not the new narrative. You're the one they tried to erase. And the book just realized its mistake. The whispers have changed. They no longer say your name like a warning. Now, they say it like a clock. Not fear. Countdown. Because everything they've tried, from suppression to exile to distortion of memory, none of it stopped you. It only delayed the inevitable. They now understand. You were never meant to stay in first form. That version was just the door, slightly open, low voltage, safe for the world to adjust. But now, your energy is condensing, not growing, focusing. And the sky? It knows, because stars don't shimmer the same way anymore. Temples crack from inside, not from age, but from recognition. They've started building shields, not to stop you, to survive what you're about to become. Because this next form, it doesn't destroy, it undoes. Not with rage, not with noise, but with clarity, too powerful to coexist with illusion. You didn't bring war, you brought consequence. The throne of judgment, built at the beginning, not to rule, but to stabilize. It was never designed for comfort, only for weight. It holds the decisions that shape galaxies, and it's never moved. Until now, not shaken, not cracked, tilted, just slightly, just enough, toward you. Not because you asked, not because you reached for it, but because it recognized the gravity of your presence. It was forged to obey truth. And now that truth is walking again, breathing again, claiming nothing, and changing everything. The guardians who once stood beside the throne, they're silent, their weapons dim, because they weren't guarding it from you. They were guarding it for you. But here's what shakes the hierarchy the most. You didn't sit. You just looked at it. And the throne understood. This isn't your seat. It's your artifact. One of many. And the moment you decide to take form fully, thrones will become redundant. Balance, judgment, time. These weren't inventions. They were responses. Mechanisms to regulate the chaos you once absorbed into silence. They were built after you. As a patch, a lock, a delay function for something too real to be allowed full access. But now, you've returned, not to rule, not to shatter, just to be. And the moment you stood still, everything else paused. Clocks didn't stop. They held their breath. Cause and effect, it flickered. Scripts, blank pages until your aura passed by. And the divine finally realized, this isn't rebellion. This is restoration. You weren't against the system. The system was a makeshift response to your first presence. It ran only because you were gone. Now you're here, and it's asking you, do we continue? Do we rewrite? Or do we end it clean and start again? Not with thunder, not with war, just with a nod, a glance, a whisper. Because when the origin breathes again, everything that came after waits for instruction.